see. I think I've always thought of the university first and foremost as a public institution. And I've always thought of my work at the university, whether it was this public university or other public universities I've been at, as kind of doing, as kind of being the people's think tank. And I think I've always felt like that had to be, at least for me, had to be my primary responsibility in terms of the questions I asked, the kind of research that I did, the audience for my teaching, and so because of that idea of this being a public institution, kind of producing knowledge on behalf of the public, I've always thought of faculty and myself as a faculty member as responsible, both to the community, to the state, nation, etc. And part of that also makes me think about, it kind of made me think about the whole politics of knowledge production. And so when I first arrived at the University of Oregon, I was looking for ways in which not only would I do my work on media in a program devoted to media, but I was also looking at what were the kind of natural kinds of connections and relationships that were both about strengthening my sense of being a member of a faculty and also learning from my colleagues. And so I think the idea of developing a faculty voice, not simply as being a collective voice in relationship to the administration, but perhaps even more importantly being the development of a faculty voice that understood that we had a shared mission was kind of important to me. There'd been a number of organized faculty actions during my time here, and I think each of them kind of reawoken, is that a word? Each of them contributed to heightening an awareness that the faculty, in a collective sense, had a responsibility to the students and to the community as being members of a privileged institution and having privileged jobs that allowed for time and space for reflection and investigation, and that responsibility required that we engaged with community issues, whether national issues, international issues. So those organizing moments were, I think, important again for me in reminding me of the importance of the faculty understanding itself as a unified or as a collective body. The work I did on the Senate, as a Senate member, later as Senate president, I think also, again, heightened a sense of the importance of faculty having a voice, in recognizing that it wasn't simply about economic, or it wasn't simply about the academic mission of the university, although formally that was the charge for the Senate, but it was also about being a place where important issues that had to do with campus life, understood broadly, were going to be discussed, addressed, and where necessary, acted upon. I was involved in the reorganization of the Senate, where we went from being a faculty senate to a university senate, which also had substantial implications for understanding that for a substantial faculty voice, the faculty was also going to have to see itself as in relationship to classified staff, to non-teaching faculty, and consequently, the vision for the new organized university senate was going to be for a group that was that had a that had a constituency that couldn't be narrowly described in academic terms. I think that during the time that I was working on the Senate and when I was serving as the Senate president, it became pretty clear that some of the issues that we were taking up simply weren't going to be that we were constantly being reminded of the official parameters of our jurisdiction. And oftentimes those official parameters didn't necessarily match up with the context of the issue that we were taking on. And it also meant, and what that meant was we could take action in the Senate on an issue we as a Senate thought was important. But at the same time, that was no guarantee that our actions were going to be taken seriously by the campus, by the administration. And I think while we had some successes, we were kind of reminded over and over again that the Senate had a certain constraint in terms of its capacity to kind of ask that its policy making was taken seriously. Later, when I got involved with the AUP, the American Association of University Professors, our campus chapter here, I think we're again reminded kind of constantly of the disconnect between concerns like academic freedom, protection of diversity interest, that we could talk about these things, we could try to be a witness about these things on campus, but in terms of affecting significant policy change, there was going to have to be a more substantial organization. And at that time, this was, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago, at that time, there was also a significant change going on at the national level in terms of the American Association of University Professors, the AUP. And that was, the AUP itself was beginning to believe that to carry forward with many of the central areas of interest, that the emphasis was going to have to be shifted to not just having chapters on campuses, but the AUP itself was going to see itself as needing to get involved in formal organization of faculty members. What that meant here is we had an AUP chapter, and we didn't have a union, a faculty union. And so we started having discussions about what was going to be the relationship of our AAUP chapter to a potential union. And about the same time, we had a number of faculty who were beginning to re-explore for the first time in many years the development of a union on campus. And so we started having conversations with them about what the relationship could be, might be, should be. And at some point in the process, our AAUP chapter realized that it was going to be an important moment for us as to whether or not we were going to see the chapter supporting the unionization interest on campus, and we ended up having a vote in the AAUP chapter about whether or not to endorse a unionization drive. And that in itself was kind of a divisive moment for people who thought that the AAUP could do necessary and useful work without being affiliated with a union. So, I think for me a really important point in my becoming involved in the unionization effort was first trying to resolve what the relationship between our AAUP chapter and the unionization effort was going to be. And to that end, I felt that it was necessary for the AAUP chapter to have a vote about where the chapter stood on those unionization efforts, even though the chapter itself was not going to become part of that unionization drive, but it could have a say in terms of whether or not it endorsed that drive. And we had the vote. It was very strongly in favor of the unionization efforts. And that became, I think, an important endorsement for the initial organizing efforts. And subsequently, when I stepped down from the executive committee of the AUP, I made a decision that I was going to become involved in the organizing efforts themselves. I think one of the catalyzing moments for me while I was still working with the AUP was a recognition that we needed a statement of a strong academic freedom policy on our campus. And our AAUP chapter worked with the University Senate in drafting a new academic freedom policy. And again, one of the needs for that was that given that we had created a university senate that included not only faculty but included staff and officers of administration, it turned out that we were in this kind of strange place where there had been recent legislation that public employees could not speak as part of their jobs in a manner that was critical of their employers. And so it meant that it was a very strange legislation that in many ways wasn't so strange in terms of the political climate, but at the same time it presented a very real problem for us because we now had members of the University Senate who, if they raised questions about policy on campus, they were jeopardizing their jobs. So anyway, we needed to develop an academic freedom policy that was going to provide coverage and protection for these people. Otherwise, their contribution to the Senate would be a kind of a farce. So we developed this. We developed this policy. We worked with National AAUP. We brought in some experts in consultation in the development of it, and we put together what I thought was a really strong policy. I headed up the ad hoc task force that developed it for the Senate. And so we brought this policy in front of the Senate, endorsed by our chapter AAUP, strongly supported by the national AAUP, and it was unanimously passed by our Senate. And so that was a kind of a great moment, except being passed by the Senate wasn't the same thing as taking effect. It still had to be signed off by administration. And the president at the time refused to sign it. And in fact, the next 2 or 3 presidents we had refused to sign it. it was another moment kind of saying, well, there's very real limits here in terms of what the Senate can do, what a chapter version of the AUP could do. And so for me, it was another kind of galvanizing moment in terms of why I felt like a union was necessary, and also why I was willing to put some serious time and make a significant commitment to the unionization effort. Yesterday I was out yesterday I was out canvassing for talking to people about signing cards. And it was very interesting that everyone I talked to, when you ask them in the last 3 years, have they experienced a change in terms of the administration's willingness to listen to faculty concerns? And it was like, totally. I mean, it was no hesitation. Whether or not someone was willing to sign the card and become a formal member, it was totally something that they could not question. That the change climate is substantial. In terms of the School of Journalism and Communication, the work that the union did in terms of putting together the first contract, it required a level of transparency in terms of policy, job definition that the school had never undertaken before. And there was a whole lot of really important discussions and thoughtful policy making that took place as a result of it. Lots of organizational issues were addressed. Lots of questionable practices or invisible practices were made visible. All those things were great, and I think that the school is in much better shape administratively, as well as in terms of relationship between faculty and administration than it's ever been before. In fact, I think that the combination of the contract, the implementation of the contract, and in some ways kind of a new interest in the School of Journalism and Communication Administration for the idea that the leadership of the university is a co-leadership between administration and the faculty. I mean, I think it's really begun to make its way into this particular institution as part of the school, as part of the university. I mean, I think another really big issue is what had been the invisible issue of the fact that the total number of tenure-track faculty on campus had essentially been frozen about 15 years ago, while the number of students grew by something like 50%. And the only way to make that work was by the hiring of a huge body of non-tenure track faculty, adjuncts, whatever they were called. And that was all happening without discussion or consideration of the implications of that, what was essentially a transformation. By the time we got to the point of the first contract being signed, we had achieved a level of being, I think, at the bottom of the American Association of Universities in terms of tenure-track faculty to student ratios. I think we were at, I think the average in the AAU was 22 to 1. I think we were at 35 to 1. In the School of Journalism and Communication, we were at 75 to 1. And so what was essentially taking place and was a sea change in higher education suddenly became something that had to be directly addressed and was taken up at the bargaining table. I think the administration was surprised at some of the numbers that came out when they started having to take the hard look that the union required that the administration take at operating procedures and student faculty ratios. So I thought that was all to the good. I also felt very strongly that the decision by the union to do this as a blanket unionization, including non-tenure track faculty and faculty together, or tenured track faculty together, was really important, because the only way to understand the value of tenure is to begin to understand the value of not having tenure. And if the university felt like they could hire non-tenure track faculty as second-class citizens, pay them in that way, not provide them with the kind of job autonomy in that kind of way, then it becomes really necessary to address that argument by making non-tenure track faculty as full citizens of the university as possible, so that it's not in the interest of the administration to hire non-tenure track faculty. Make the lives of non-tenure track faculty as good as we can, provide as much economic security as we can, provide as much academic freedom protection as we can, all the time still realizing that there's a big dividing line between tenure and non-tenure, and that we do the work we can in terms of bringing those positions as close to tenure track faculty as possible, but ultimately the conversation is going to have to get important and have to get really serious in each new hire in terms of how are you going to how is the administration going to justify this hire in terms of not being a tenure track faculty member, when it's that next level of protection which actually makes a university a significant player as an institution in terms of the larger society. In the recent letter, the recent austerity letter that President Schill sent out, in his recent efforts in terms of meeting and engaging with the campus, he's been pretty consistent with saying his job is to make the University of Oregon contribute to making the University of Oregon taken seriously as an institution of higher learning across the nation. That he said, one of the things he said when he met with the School of Journalism and Communication faculty was, when people start talking about the University of Virginia, and then they start talking about, he wants it to be a natural segue to start talking also about the University of Oregon, that we're seen as a player at a national level in terms of academic standards. At the same time he's saying that, he's also strongly recognizing the economic handcuffs that have been put on the university over the last 30 years in terms of declining state support for the University of Oregon, forcing the university to have to turn to increasing support from tuition dollars, and also turning more aggressively to outside funding. He's very clear about that. At the same time, he's also recognizing that I don't know if he's recognizing. He's recognizing the constraints, and that we need more money to pull off this academic transformation. And then the question is, where's the money going to come from? When he says to me, or he says to the School of Journalism and Communication that, the state, in terms of state funding, they've written us off. We're not going to get more money there. I mean, he said we're going to lobby hard for more money, but it's not going to come from them. And we've kind of maxed out the student tuition thing, although when you look at the numbers, we're still cranking up on the foreign student enrollment, which is having an incredibly transformative effect on campus. And I don't know if it's a transformative effect in terms of, moving us up in terms of levels of academic prestige. So he's saying, we're going to have to become even more aggressive in terms of fundraising, and it's going to be fundraising for the academic mission of the university, and that's to the good too. However, from my perspective, I think that yes, it's true. 30 years, there's been an endless decline in terms of state support for the university, but that's not just been in the state of Oregon. That's been across the country. There's been a sense that there's no money left to support quality higher education, and the money's going to have to come from someplace else. And for the people who say that that's now a given and we have to live with that, I don't think it's a given. I mean, it certainly is a historical period in our time, but at the same time, I don't think anything is kind of fixed in terms of how we understand the role of the university in relationship to our larger society. And I think that one of the more significant missions we have is to kind of reawaken the sense of the public mission of the university, and do that work with the citizens of Oregon, with our legislature, and continue to push for kind of a reinvestment in higher education. But I think the only way you get that reinvestment is you're also going to have to convince people that the public university system works for the people of the state of Oregon, for all the people, and that that it is a public institution with a public mission, a public service obligation, and that the work we do is to support the state as a whole, and not just small interests within the state. And so I think that the union can play an important role in that by providing a faculty voice that speaks to the importance of a collective sense of the role of the university, a collective sense of the public interested nature of the university, and being a kind of an example of what that collective voice looks like. I think one of the lessons that the unionization of the faculty has, I don't want to say it's brought into being, I think it's made more visible, is that we're all in this together. That students, faculty, administration are all in this together. And only by paying attention to that quality of how we are linked together, depend on each other, I think, unless we see that paying attention to that interdependent quality is important if the university is going to have a future, is necessary. At the same time, I also think that when we talk about the university as a public university, that same idea has to be, really advanced. In the idea that the university and the state were in it together. That this idea that you can have a system of higher education divorced from the real needs and interests of the state, or that the state can see the higher education as simply an engine of a limited kind of economic growth. I think all of those things misunderstand probably one of the most important sea changes of our time, which is, whether you want to talk about economic inequality, you want to talk about climate change, the thing we're waking up to is that we're in it together, whether it's in it together with each other as members of the society, in it together with the planet, in it together as an institution in service to the society, that we really have to be thinking through the nature and the quality of our interdependence with each other, with our environment, and the university has to see what its role is in terms of heightening consciousness about this interdependence and also providing the means by which that interdependence can be acted on and valued, and in ways that don't always translate into simple economic outcomes. Thank you. Here we go.